The knock came 3 times, faint, deliberate, impossibly human against a storm that had been swallowing the mountain whole for 2 days straight. Caleb Ridge stood frozen in his cabin, firelight casting shadows across a face that hadn't seen another soul in 4 years. Nobody climbed to these heights. Nobody found this place unless they were running from something worse than weather. His hand moved to the rifle above the door, then stopped. Because the fourth knock never came. Just silence. And silence, in a storm like this, meant only one thing. Someone was dying on his doorstep. If you're ready to discover whether mercy can heal the deepest wounds, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The cabin had been built by someone who understood that mountains don't forgive. Stone foundations sunk deep into bedrock, timber walls sealed with pitch and moss, a chimney that drew smoke even when the wind screamed down from the peaks like something alive and hungry. Caleb had bought it from a widow 6 winters ago, paying cash and asking no questions, and she'd done him the same courtesy. The isolation suited him. 16 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a trail that disappeared under snow from November through April, it was exactly what he'd needed when the world became too loud with its sympathies and sorrows. He'd been reading when the knocking started, the same paragraph of the same book he'd been reading for 3 months, the words sliding past without meaning, his mind somewhere between the flames and nowhere at all. The storm had arrived 2 days earlier, one of those late-season monsters that came down from Canada with something to prove. Caleb had prepared like he always did, firewood stacked to the rafters, smoked venison and dried beans enough to last a month, kerosene for the lamp, and batteries for the radio that mostly pulled static but occasionally caught weather warnings from the ranger station in Millbrook Valley. 3 knocks. Faint. Human. His first thought was that he'd imagined it. The storm did things to perception, created shapes in the white, made you hear voices in the wind. He'd learned that the first winter, when loneliness was still new enough to hurt sharp instead of dull. But then it came again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, each one weaker than the last. Caleb moved to the door with the rifle in his hands, instinct and isolation having taught him that mountain country bred unpredictable visitors. Hunters lost and desperate, drifters running from debts or laws or demons that wore their own faces. Once, a man with eyes that held too much nothing, asking for water and looking at the cabin like he was calculating what it contained and whether Caleb could stop him from taking it. That man had left without trouble, but only after Caleb made it clear the rifle wasn't decorative. "Who's there?" His voice came out rougher than he remembered it, 4 years of minimal use having turned speech into something he had to consciously produce. Nothing, just wind tearing through the pines and the rattle of ice against the shutters. He waited, counting heartbeats. At 30, he pulled the heavy timber bolt free and cracked the door 6 inches, rifle barrel leading, squinting against the blast of frozen air that hit his face like a physical blow. The woman was crumpled against the doorframe, half collapsed, one hand still raised as if to knock a 4th time. She wore a coat that had probably been green once, but was now the colorless gray of long use and longer weather. Snow caked her shoulders, her hair, the wool scarf wrapped around her face. She looked up at him with eyes that should have been panicked, desperate, afraid, but instead held something closer to resignation. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was thin as paper. "I can't walk anymore." For a moment that stretched too long, Caleb stood frozen in a calculus of risk and conscience. Letting strangers in meant complications, meant questions and stories and the possibility that whoever this was would look at him and see the man he'd been before he became the man who lived alone on a mountain. But leaving her meant listening to her die in the storm, and that was a sound he suspected would follow him longer than any complication. "Can you stand?" She tried. Made it perhaps 6 inches upward before her legs gave and she slumped back, breathing hard. Up close he could see she wasn't young, 60 at minimum, maybe 70, with that particular kind of weather that came from a hard life rather than a long one. Caleb leaned the rifle against the interior wall and stepped into the storm, the cold so intense it felt like his lungs were filling with glass. He got one arm under her shoulders, another beneath her knees, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and layered clothing, and she made a small sound that might have been pain or relief or both. Inside, he kicked the door shut and carried her to the chair nearest the fire. She collapsed into it with a shuddering breath, ice already beginning to melt from her coat and pool on the floorboards. Her face, revealed as the scarf fell away, was mapped with wrinkles and windburn, lips cracked and faintly blue despite the cabin's warmth. "Sick," she managed. "I'm sick. Walked as far as I could." "From where?" "Millbrook. 16 miles. In this weather. Impossible." Caleb grabbed blankets from the bed, wool, heavy, smelling of cedar from the chest he stored them in, and wrapped them around her shoulders. "You couldn't have walked from Millbrook in this." "Not today." She closed her eyes, swaying slightly. 3 days ago. Got caught. Tried to find shelter. Found your cabin instead. 3 days in the mountains during the storm. She should have been dead. Would have been, probably, if she'd been anywhere else. But there was a cave network about 2 miles west, shallow but enough to break the wind, and a few stands of dense pine that could shield someone from the worst of it if they knew what they were doing. "You know mountains." It wasn't a question. A nod, barely perceptible. "Used to. Long time ago." He moved to the kitchen area, 3 shelves and a counter, and a wood-burning stove that had been there when he bought the place, and filled a pot with snow from the bucket by the door, setting it to melt and heat. She needed water first, then food, then questions. In that order. It was how you kept people alive, and despite every wall he'd built, despite the years of chosen solitude, that instinct remained. While the water heated, he studied her. The coat was old but well-maintained, patches sewn with careful stitches. Her boots were good, real leather, broken in, the kind that cost money and lasted decades. Under the blankets, he could see a canvas pack, small and battered. Not a drifter then. Not someone running wild. Someone who had left with purpose and preparation, even if that purpose had gone sideways somewhere in the storm. The water boiled. He filled a tin cup and brought it to her, waiting while she wrapped both hands around it and sipped with the careful desperation of someone who understood thirst at a cellular level. "What's your name?" he asked, surprising himself. "Evelyn. Evelyn Cross." She looked up at him with eyes that were clearer now, brown and deep and carrying something he recognized but couldn't name. "Thank you for opening the door." Caleb Ridge. He didn't know why he offered it. Names meant connection, and connection meant complication, but it seemed cruel to remain nameless to someone you'd pulled from the edge of dying. "Caleb." She tested it, tasting the syllables. "Strong name. Old name." "It's just a name." She smiled, faint. "Nothing's just anything." He went back to the stove and ladled venison stew from the pot that had been simmering since morning, meat and potatoes and wild onions he'd gathered the previous summer. The routine of survival. Breakfast stew, lunch stew, dinner stew, each serving putting fuel in the furnace that kept a body moving through mountain winters. He brought her a bowl and she ate slowly, each spoonful a deliberate act. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind hit the cabin in waves that made the timber creak and the shutters bang despite being latched. Snow built against the northern wall in drifts that would reach the windows by morning. Caleb had weathered worse. The second winter had brought a blizzard that lasted 9 days and buried the cabin to the roofline, but this was substantial. 2 days at minimum before it broke. Maybe 3. Maybe more. "You'll stay here until it passes," he said, making it statement rather than question. "I don't want to impose, You'll die if you leave. Not an imposition, just fact." Evelyn finished the stew and set the bowl aside, pulling the blankets tighter. "You live alone?" "Yes." "By choice?" "Yes." He waited for the follow-up questions. Why? For how long? Running from what? But they didn't come. She simply nodded and closed her eyes, swaying again with exhaustion that went deeper than the storm. "You can have the bed," Caleb said. "I'll take the floor." "I can't." "You can and you will. You've been walking in a blizzard for 3 days. I've been sitting in a chair reading the same paragraph for 3 months. Take the bed." Something shifted in her expression, gratitude mixed with something that might have been recognition. "You're kinder than you want people to know." "I'm practical. You need rest more than I need comfort." He helped her to the bed, a simple frame built from pine and stuffed with a mattress he'd ordered from a catalog and hauled up the mountain strapped to a mule 5 years ago. She sank into it with a sound that was almost pain, and within seconds her breathing had deepened into sleep. Caleb stood watching for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away and added wood to the fire. The cabin settled into new rhythms, 2 people breathing, 2 hearts beating, 2 lives temporarily sharing space that had been solitary so long he'd almost forgotten what company felt like. He made a bedroll from extra blankets and stretched out on the floor in front of the hearth, the rifle within arm's reach, because habits born from isolation didn't die easy. The storm hammered the world outside. Inside, firelight danced shadows across walls that had heard nothing but his own thoughts for years. Sleep came slowly, tangled with questions he hadn't asked and wouldn't ask because asking meant knowing, and knowing meant caring, and caring meant all the things he'd climbed a mountain to escape. Morning arrived as a gray suggestion beyond the shutters. Caleb woke to the sound of wood shifting in the fire and Evelyn's ragged breathing, too fast, too shallow. He was up instantly, the floor cold beneath his feet despite the cabin's warmth. She was still asleep but fitful, face flushed, forehead damp. Fever. He'd suspected it last night but hoped the warmth and food would be enough. They weren't. He had medicine, basic supplies kept for emergencies that rarely came. Aspirin, antibiotics left over from a tooth infection 3 years ago, willow bark tea that could bring down inflammation if brewed strong. He started water heating and crushed 3 aspirin into powder, mixing it with honey so the bitterness would go down easier. Evelyn, he touched her shoulder lightly. Need you to wake up. Her eyes opened, unfocused and bright. David? No, Caleb, you're in my cabin. You have a fever. Need you to take this. She blinked, reality reassembling itself behind her eyes. Sorry, I thought... She didn't finish, just accepted the mixture and swallowed it with a grimace. Who's David? Someone from a long time ago. She sank back against the pillow. How long was I asleep? 8 hours. Storm's still heavy. You're staying in bed today. I should... Nothing. You should do nothing except rest and let your body fight whatever you picked up in the cold. He spent the morning in the small routines that structured his days. Checking the firewood supply, though he knew it was fine, melting snow for water, though the bucket was still half full, inventorying the food stores, though he'd counted everything 3 days ago, movement for movement's sake, activity to fill the space where silence usually lived. Around noon, Evelyn woke again, clearer this time, the fever temporarily beaten back by medicine and rest. He brought her broth, just the liquid from the stew pot, salted and hot, and she drank it slowly, hands steadier than the night before. You didn't have to do this, she said. Do what? Any of it. Opening the door, sharing your bed, your food, your medicine. What was the alternative? Letting me pass in the storm. It would have been easier. Caleb sat in the chair by the fire, his own bowl of stew balanced on his knee. Easier isn't always right. But it's often what people choose. I'm not people. She smiled at that, faint but genuine. No, I don't think you are. They ate in silence, punctuated only by the storm's ongoing assault. Wind screamed down the mountain in waves that made even the solid cabin feel temporary, fragile, a brief shelter against inevitability. But the walls held because they'd been built to hold, and the fire burned because Caleb kept feeding it, and somehow that felt important in ways he didn't examine too closely. Can I ask you something? Evelyn's voice broke the quiet carefully, like she was testing ice. You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. How long have you been up here? 4 years, 5 this November. That's a long time to be alone. It's the right amount of time for me. She nodded, accepting it without judgment. I taught school for 38 years, elementary, second grade mostly. You learn a lot about people when you see them young. They haven't learned to hide yet. Haven't figured out what faces to wear for what situations. They're just purely themselves, scared and brave and mean and kind all at once, sometimes in the same minute. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm trying to say that I recognize hiding when I see it. And you're not hiding from the world, Caleb. You're hiding from yourself. The words landed harder than they should have, finding truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He He set his bowl down with more force than necessary. You don't know anything about me. I know you live alone on a mountain. I know you opened your door in a storm when closing it would have been safer. I know you gave up your bed without being asked and shared medicine you probably can't replace easily. I know your hands shake when you think I'm not looking, and you stare at the fire like you're trying to see something in it that isn't there. She paused. I know loss when I see it. Takes one to know one. Caleb stood abruptly. You should rest. Caleb, rest. Fever will come back. Always does the first day. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. I'm checking the traps. Be back before dark. Outside, the storm swallowed him instantly. Wind and snow and cold so sharp it cut through wool and skin and found the bones beneath. He pushed into it anyway, needing the punishment, needing the reminder that some pains were clean and immediate and had nothing to do with memory. The trapline was a circuit he ran twice weekly in winter, a dozen snares set along game trails where rabbits and the occasional fox moved despite the weather. Most were empty today, snow having buried them or scared the animals deeper into their warrens. But the last trap held a snowshoe hare, frozen solid, caught sometime yesterday before the storm reached full fury. He reset the snare and turned back, the hare a cold weight in his pack. The return journey was harder, wind in his face now, each step requiring conscious effort. By the time the cabin emerged from the white, his lungs burned and his fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. Evelyn was sitting up when he came in, blankets wrapped around her shoulders, watching the fire. She looked at him with those deep brown eyes that missed nothing. I'm sorry, she said. I push too hard sometimes. Always have. Comes from teaching. You develop a sense for what students need to hear versus what they want to hear. But you're not my student, and I have no right. Caleb hung his coat and set the hare on the counter. Nothing to apologize for. There is. You saved my life. I repaid you by digging at wounds. That's not gratitude. He began the work of preparing the hare, skinning, cleaning, sectioning for the stew pot. The knife moved with practiced efficiency through fur and flesh, reducing the animal to components: meat, bones for broth, hide to be cured and used. Nothing wasted. Mountains taught you that quickly. My son's name was Matthew, he said, surprising himself again. He was 19, died 6 years ago, February. Car accident on black ice, coming home from college for winter break. Driver of the other car walked away without a scratch. Matthew didn't walk away at all. The knife paused. He forced it to continue moving. His mother, my wife, she tried to hold on. We both did. But grief doesn't share space well. Needs too much room. We started avoiding each other without meaning to, because being together meant looking at the space he should have filled. She wanted to talk about him constantly. I couldn't talk about him at all. Different methods. Same goal, trying not to drown. He dropped the meat into the pot, added water and salt and herbs he'd dried the previous summer. We divorced a year after. She moved to Portland to be near her sister. I came here. Sold everything else. House, car, most of what we owned. Kept only what I could carry. Seemed right, somehow. He was gone, so the life we'd built around him had to be gone too. Evelyn hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just listened with the particular quality of attention that made words feel safe. For 4 years, I've been practicing not being his father, not being anyone's husband, just being Caleb Ridge, man on a mountain, nothing before and nothing after. And most days it works. He turned to face her finally. But you're right. I'm not hiding from the world. I'm hiding from the fact that being his father was the best thing I ever was. And I don't know how to be anything else worth being. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the storm and the fire and their breathing. I had a daughter, Evelyn said quietly. Emma. Born with a heart defect the doctors said would kill her before 5. She made it to 12. 12 years of specialists and hospitals and hope that kept not quite dying even when it should have. When she finally went, it was almost a relief. Then I hated myself for feeling relief. Hated myself for a long time. She pulled the blankets tighter. Her father left when she was 3. Couldn't handle it. I taught during the day and sat with her at night and learned every prayer in every religion looking for one that would work. None did. After she died, I taught for another 15 years because what else was there? Then I retired and tried to figure out what life looked like when it wasn't built around managing death. And I walked. Started small, trails near town, day hikes, then longer. Then I'd be gone for weeks, following paths that led to other paths. Looking for something I couldn't name. Maybe looking for her, in the stupid way we look for the dead in places they never were. She met his eyes. 3 months ago, I was going through boxes in my attic and found a letter. Old from years ago. It was from a student who'd written to me after graduating college. He wanted to thank me, said I'd made him feel like he mattered when his home life was hell. Said I'd quite possibly saved his life by believing he was worth something. Her voice wavered slightly. His name was Matthew Ridge. The cabin seemed to contract. Caleb felt the words land but couldn't process them, like hearing something in a language he'd once spoken but forgotten. What? I taught him when he was 7, second grade. Quiet boy, always drawing in the margins of his papers. Beautiful drawings, mountains mostly, trees and trails and high places. His parents had just separated and he was struggling. I kept him after class sometimes, let him draw and talk or not talk. By the end of the year, he was doing better, smiling more. I moved to 4th grade teaching the next year and lost track of him. Didn't hear from him again until that letter, written when he was in college. She pulled the blanket aside and reached into her pack, withdrawing a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased from years of being carried. He wrote about studying environmental science, about wanting to work in conservation, about hiking the Cascades and feeling like he understood something essential up there that he couldn't find anywhere else. He wrote. She opened the letter with shaking hands. He wrote, "You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, that paying attention to people is the most important work there is. I'm going to spend my life paying attention to mountains the way you paid attention to me." Caleb couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The letter in her hands was impossible. A piece of Matthew's handwriting existing in this cabin where Matthew had never been. Would never be, except now he was, reaching backward through time to collapse the distance Caleb had spent 4 years building. "That's not possible," he managed. "I know it's not, but it is." Evelyn's eyes were wet. "When I saw your name on the mailbox at the trailhead, Caleb Ridge, mile 16, I thought it was coincidence. Then I got closer and saw you, and there was something in your face that reminded me of that boy. The same sadness he had when he was 7, the same way of looking at things like you're trying to memorize them before they disappear. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wasn't sure. Because even if I was, what would I say? Your son once wrote me a letter. I taught him for 1 year 20 years ago. It seemed cruel dragging grief into the open uninvited. But it was open now. It was open and bleeding and filling the cabin with all the things Caleb had climbed a mountain to escape. He turned away, gripping the counter, feeling the timber grain under his palms because physical sensation was manageable and this wasn't. He loved mountains, Caleb said finally. Talked about them constantly. Wanted to protect them. Wanted to make sure they'd still be there for people who needed them. A sound that might have been a laugh or a sob caught in his throat. He died on a highway in Ohio, flattest place in America. Didn't even get to die somewhere beautiful. Caleb, you should rest. Fever will come back. Please don't. I said rest. He grabbed his coat again and went back into the storm. Even though night was coming and the temperature was dropping and going out in these conditions was the kind of stupid that killed people. But the cabin was too small suddenly, too full of ghosts and letters and the impossible collision of past and present. He made it maybe 30 yards before the wind drove him to his knees. Snow filled his mouth and eyes and lungs. He couldn't see the cabin anymore, couldn't see anything except white, and the terrible recognition that Evelyn hadn't come to his door by accident. That there were no accidents on mountains, only the things they chose to reveal. Strong hands found his shoulders. Evelyn, wrapped in blankets and fever and impossible strength, dragging him back toward firelight. "Don't you dare!" she shouted over the wind. "Don't you dare leave me in there alone to die because you're afraid of feeling something." Together they fought back to the cabin. Inside they collapsed against the closed door, gasping, ice melting from their faces. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "Don't be sorry. Be here. Be alive. Be willing to let your son's memory exist in this cabin without running from it." He looked at her. This woman who had known Matthew when Matthew was still becoming Matthew, who had shown kindness to a struggling child, and received thanks that she'd carried through years until it led her here, to this mountain, to this storm, to this moment. "Tell me about him," Evelyn said. "Not how he died, how he lived." And slowly, with the storm raging and the fire burning and the impossible weight of coincidence or fate or whatever force had brought her to his door, Caleb began to speak. He told her about Matthew's laugh, loud and unguarded and infectious. About the summer Matthew was 13, and they'd hiked the Appalachian Trail section by section, just the two of them, talking about everything and nothing. About the way Matthew could identify bird calls at a distance, a skill Caleb had never managed to learn. About the arguments they'd had when Matthew chose environmental science over engineering, arguments Caleb regretted every day since because what did it matter, in the end, what degree someone earned if they didn't get to use it? He talked until his voice gave out, and Evelyn listened with the same attention she'd probably given Matthew when he was 7, and learning that someone could witness him without judgment. When silence finally returned, it felt different. Less like isolation and more like shared space. Less like running and more like rest. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me bring him here. For not making me carry him alone anymore." Caleb nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside something had shifted. The cabin felt warmer despite the fire being the same. The walls felt more solid despite being the same timber. They sat together in the firelight, two people carrying impossible losses, brought together by weather and coincidence, and a letter written years ago by a boy who'd loved mountains and the teacher who'd believed he mattered. Neither spoke, but neither needed to. Some silences held more than words ever could. The storm would break eventually, the fever would pass. Evelyn would heal or wouldn't, and Caleb would return to his routines or wouldn't, and the mountain would remain because mountains always remained. But for now, in this moment, they simply existed together in the warmth and the snow, and the memory of a boy who'd learned that paying attention was the most important work there is. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The storm broke on the 4th day, not with drama, but with gradual surrender. The wind died first, its howling reduced to whispers, then silence. The snow continued falling, but gently now, drifting down in lazy spirals instead of horizontal assaults. Caleb woke to pale sunlight filtering through gaps in the shutters, the first real light he'd seen in nearly a week. Evelyn was still asleep, her breathing steady and deep, the fever finally broken sometime during the night. He'd kept vigil through the worst of it, changing cool cloths on her forehead, coaxing water and willow bark tea past her lips when she woke confused and shaking. There'd been a moment around midnight when her temperature spiked so high he'd genuinely considered trying to carry her down the mountain, storm or no storm. But she'd fought through it with the same quiet tenacity she seemed to approach everything, and by dawn the crisis had passed. He dressed quietly and stepped outside into air so cold and still, it felt brittle, like breathing would shatter it. The world had been transformed. Snow reached past his knees in the clearing, deeper where drifts had formed against the cabin's north wall. The pines stood silent under their white burden, branches bent but not broken. In the distance, the peaks cut sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Beautiful. Lethal. The mountain in all its contradictions. He spent the morning digging out, clearing paths to the woodshed, the storage cache, the outhouse he'd built 50 yards downslope. The work was hard and repetitive and exactly what he needed, physical labor that demanded nothing but effort and endurance. Sweat soaked through his undershirt despite the cold. His shoulders burned, his hands blistered even through gloves, and for hours he thought of nothing but the next shovelful, the next cleared foot, the next small victory against winter's casual cruelty. When he finally came back inside, Evelyn was awake and sitting at the table with a cup of tea she'd made herself. She looked fragile still, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been for days. "You shouldn't be up," Caleb said, shaking snow from his coat. "I'm tired of that bed, tired of being weak. She sipped her tea. Besides, I wanted to see the world again. Feels like I've been underwater. You nearly were. That fever could have killed you. But it didn't, thanks to you. She paused. How long was I out? 3 days, on and off. You'd wake sometimes, but you weren't really here. Talked to people who weren't in the room, called me David twice, Emma once. Something painful crossed her face. I'm sorry you had to see that. Nothing to be sorry for. Fever does what it does. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, the brew strong enough to strip paint. You need to eat. Real food, not just broth. I'm not sure I can keep anything down yet. You'll try anyway. Body needs fuel to finish healing. He made her oatmeal cooked with dried apples and cinnamon, sweet and soft enough for a recovering stomach. She ate slowly, each spoonful a deliberate act, and kept it down. Progress. They settled into a rhythm over the following days as Evelyn regained strength and the mountain emerged from its coating of white. Caleb maintained his routines, checking traps, splitting wood, melting snow for water, but the routines felt different now, punctuated by another person's presence. Evelyn helped where she could, insisting despite his protests that she needed to feel useful. She washed dishes, mended a tear in his spare coat, reorganized his meager pantry with the efficient precision of someone who'd managed classroom supplies for 4 decades. They talked, but carefully, both aware they'd ventured close to raw edges during the storm and needed to approach each other more gently now. She told him about her years teaching, the students who'd stayed with her and the ones who'd disappeared into whatever lives they'd built. He told her about the work he'd done before Matthew died, carpentry mostly, building custom furniture for people who valued craft over speed. His hands still remembered the skills, even if he hadn't used them in years. Why did you stop? Evelyn asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her with tea and him with nothing, just watching the flames. Same reason I stopped everything else. Didn't seem to matter anymore. But you were good at it? I was adequate. Matthew thought you were better than adequate. He told me once that you'd built his bedroom furniture by hand, said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned. Caleb's hands tightened on his knees. He told you that? In the letter. There was a whole paragraph about it, how you'd let him help sand the wood when he was little, how you'd carved his initials on the underside of the desk where no one could see but he'd always know they were there. I forgot about that. The words came out rough. The initials. What happened to the furniture? Sold it with the house, couldn't look at it, couldn't stand the thought of someone else using it but couldn't keep it either. He stared at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of work and weather. His mother wanted to keep everything, wanted to turn his room into a shrine. I wanted to burn it all, start over, pretend we could build something new from the ashes. Neither approach worked. Grief doesn't have a right way. No, just 1,000 wrong ones you try until you find something you can survive. Evelyn set her cup down. Can I ask you something difficult? You've been asking difficult things since you got here. Why stop now? Do you regret opening the door? He considered it honestly. I don't know. Part of me wishes I'd left it closed, that I could have gone on telling myself the isolation was enough, that I'd successfully carved out a life where the past couldn't reach me. But you brought Matthew here anyway. Not his body, not even his memory really, just proof that he existed in the world in ways I didn't know about, that he touched people and they remembered. And that's difficult. That's everything. It means he wasn't just mine to lose. He belonged to the world too, and the world lost him. And I've been acting like my grief was the only one that mattered. Your grief does matter. But it's not the only thing that matters. That's what I'm starting to understand. That's what you're forcing me to see. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Hers was small and warm and mapped with age. His was large and rough and had forgotten what human contact felt like. They stayed that way for a long moment, not speaking, just existing together in the firelight and the recognition that some bridges only get built through accidental compassion. The next morning brought visitors. Caleb heard them before he saw them. Voices carrying through the crystalline air, men's voices, calling his name. He stepped outside to find 3 figures trudging up the trail, breaking through snow that reached their thighs in places. He recognized them. Tom Hendricks, who ran the general store in Millbrook Valley, Marcus Webb, a ranger from the station, and James Cross, a logger who lived on the mountain's western slope. "Caleb," Tom called, breathing hard from the climb. "Thank Christ, we were starting to think the storm got you." "I'm fine. Cabin solid." They reached the clearing, red-faced and sweating despite the cold. Marcus pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead. "We're looking for someone. Elderly woman, name of Evelyn Cross, James's mother. She went missing a week ago, took off hiking, and never came back. When the storm hit, we thought—" He stopped. "Is she here?" "I'm here," Evelyn said from the doorway, wrapped in blankets, looking small and frail and very much alive. "Mom." James pushed past Caleb and grabbed his mother in a hug that lifted her off her feet. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" "I'm fine, James. Put me down." "You're not fine. You disappeared into a mountain in winter without telling anyone where you were going. You could have died. You should have died." "Well, I didn't, thanks to Mr. Ridge." The three men turned to look at Caleb with expressions that ranged from gratitude to confusion to something that might have been suspicion. Tom spoke first. "You've had her this whole time?" "She showed up 4 days ago, middle of the storm, sick with fever. I gave her shelter." 4 days, Marcus repeated. "And you didn't think to let anyone know?" "How? Storm knocked out radio reception. Even if it hadn't, I don't keep a radio." "You could have come down to town. In that weather, with a woman burning up with fever? You know better than that, Marcus." The ranger had the grace to look embarrassed. "You're right. I'm sorry. Just been a long week of searching and worrying." James still held his mother like she might evaporate. "Why, Mom, why would you do something so reckless?" "I wasn't being reckless. I was walking. I've walked these mountains for months. I know what I'm doing." "You got caught in a blizzard and nearly died." "But I didn't die. I found shelter. I survived. Give me some credit." "Credit?" James's voice rose. "You're 73 years old with no business being out here alone in the first place, and you want credit for surviving a situation you never should have been in?" "I'm 73 years old and capable of making my own decisions about where I go and what I do. I don't need your permission or your protection." The argument continued, mother and son circling familiar territory with the ease of people who'd fought this fight before. Tom and Marcus exchanged glances and stepped aside, letting the family drama unfold without them. Tom approached Caleb with his hand extended. "Regardless of the circumstances, you saved her life. Town's grateful." Caleb shook his hand briefly. "Just did what anyone would do." "That's not true, and you know it. Plenty of people would have left the door closed." "Then plenty of people are cowards." Tom laughed, surprised. "Fair enough." He glanced back at Evelyn and James, still arguing. "She's stubborn as they come. Has been ever since her daughter died. Started walking and never really stopped. James worries himself sick over it, but she won't listen." "Can't make someone stop living just because you're afraid they'll die," Caleb said quietly. "No, I suppose you can't." Marcus joined them, his ranger's eye taking in the cabin, the cleared paths, the stacked firewood. "You've got a good setup here, solid, but it's isolated. You ever think about coming down to town more often? Storm like this could have trapped you for weeks." "That was the idea. Still, wouldn't hurt to have people know you're alive up here." "People knowing feels a lot like people caring, and people caring leads to people expecting things. I'm not interested in expectations." "Not even from people who might help you in an emergency?" "Haven't had an emergency in 4 years. Don't plan on starting now." Marcus studied him with the particular intensity of someone trained to read situations and people. "You know, there's a difference between solitude and isolation. One's healthy, the other's just slow dying. I'll take my chances." The argument between Evelyn and James had reached some kind of resolution, or at least a temporary ceasefire. James looked exhausted, his mother defiant, both of them wearing expressions of love and frustration in equal measure. "I'm taking you home," James said finally. "I'm not ready to go home. You just recovered from a fever that nearly killed you. You're going home." Evelyn turned to Caleb. "Tell him I'm fine." "You're recovering, not the same as fine." "Traitor." "Realist. You need rest and care and probably a doctor to make sure the fever's actually gone. and not just hiding. She scowled but didn't argue further, which told Caleb she knew he was right even if she hated admitting it. James helped her back inside to gather her things, the small pack, the weathered coat, the letter she'd carried across miles and years. Caleb watched from the doorway, feeling something uncomfortably close to loss settling in his chest. When she emerged again, bundled and ready for the journey down, she stopped in front of him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. You already thanked me. And I'm thanking you again. You didn't have to open that door, didn't have to share your space or your food or your grief. But you did, and it mattered. Evelyn, let me finish." She took his hand. "You think you're hiding up here, but you're not. You're waiting. Waiting for a reason to come back to the world. I don't know if I'm that reason. Probably not. But maybe I'm proof that the world still needs people like you in it. People who open doors in storms. People who remember that kindness matters even when nothing else seems to." Caleb couldn't find words, so he just nodded. She reached into her coat and pulled out the letter. Matthew's letter, creased and yellowed and carrying more weight than paper should be able to hold. "Keep this," she said, pressing it into his hand. "I can't. You can. You should. It belongs here with you. He'd want you to have it. Evelyn, that's yours. You carried it all this time. I carried it until I found where it needed to be. Now I've found it." She closed his fingers around the paper. "Read it when you're ready, or don't. But know that it exists. Know that your son was kind and thoughtful and grateful. Know that he understood what you taught him about paying attention." James appeared at her elbow. "Mom, we need to go. Temperature's dropping." She squeezed Caleb's hand once more, then turned and let her son help her down the steps and into the snow. Tom and Marcus followed, the four of them forming a careful line down the trail, breaking through drifts that would have been impassable alone but became manageable through shared effort. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched them go, the letter heavy in his hand, the cabin suddenly cavernous behind him. They disappeared around a bend in the trail, and the mountain returned to its customary silence. He went inside and added wood to the fire, even though it didn't need it. The cabin felt wrong, too large, too empty, echoing with absences both old and new. For 4 years, this space had been enough, a shelter against weather and memory, a place where he could exist without context or history. But Evelyn had brought context anyway, had dragged history through his door wrapped in fever and coincidence, and now that she was gone, the isolation felt less like peace and more like what Marcus had called it: slow dying. He sat in the chair by the fire and unfolded the letter. The paper was fragile, threatening to tear along the creases. Matthew's handwriting filled the page. Neat, careful, the script of someone who'd been taught that how you presented words mattered as much as the words themselves. Caleb's hands shook as he read. "Dear Mrs. Cross, I hope you remember me. I was in your second grade class 15 years ago, the quiet kid who drew mountains on everything. I'm writing because I'm in my 3rd year of college now, studying environmental science, and I realized I never thanked you for something important. When I was 7, my parents were splitting up, and I felt like the world was ending. Home was angry all the time. I didn't understand why people who supposedly loved each other could hurt each other so much. I started to think maybe love wasn't real, just something adults pretended at until they got tired of pretending. Then I had you as a teacher. You noticed I was struggling even though I tried to hide it. You kept me after class and let me draw while you graded papers. You didn't make me talk about what was wrong. You just sat there and existed near me, and somehow that was enough. You paid attention without demanding anything in return. One day you told me that kindness wasn't weakness, that the strongest people were the ones who chose to be gentle, even when the world was hard. I didn't really understand what you meant at the time, but I remembered it. And as I got older, I started to see it everywhere. My dad building furniture by hand, even though buying it would have been easier, taking time to carve my initials where no one could see because he knew I'd know they were there. My mom staying patient through my teenage years when I was difficult and angry and didn't deserve patience. People choosing to care even when caring was hard. Now I'm studying how to protect wild places, and I realize it's the same principle. Mountains don't need us. They existed long before we got here, and will exist long after we're gone. but we need them. We need to know there are places that don't change, that stay beautiful and terrible and indifferent to our problems. And protecting them is an act of kindness toward people who haven't been born yet, who will need the mountains the same way I need them now. You taught me that paying attention is the most important work there is. I'm going to spend my life paying attention to mountains the way you paid attention to me. Not trying to fix them or change them, just witnessing them and making sure they continue to exist. Thank you for believing a quiet 7-year-old was worth your time. Thank you for teaching me that gentleness is strength. I carry that lesson everywhere I go. With gratitude, Matthew Ridge. Caleb read it twice, then a third time, then sat holding it while the fire burned down and the light outside shifted from afternoon to evening. The words blurred as his eyes filled, and he didn't try to stop it. Let himself cry for the first time in 4 years, not the angry, bitter tears he'd shed in the weeks after the accident, but something quieter and deeper. Grief for the loss. Gratitude for what had been. Wonder that his son had understood something Caleb himself was only now beginning to grasp. That kindness wasn't weakness, that paying attention mattered, that you could choose to be gentle even when the world was hard. Matthew had learned it from a teacher who'd shown him compassion when he needed it most. But before that, the letter suggested, he'd learned it from watching Caleb, building furniture by hand, carving initials in hidden places, taking time to do things right even when quick would have been easier. Had Caleb been that person? He tried to remember the man he'd been before the accident, before the divorce, before the mountain. A carpenter who believed craft mattered. A father who'd hiked sections of the Appalachian Trail with his son, talking about everything and nothing. A husband who'd tried to hold marriage together even as grief pulled it apart. Not perfect, not even particularly good at the end, but someone who'd tried. Someone who'd apparently taught his son something worth learning, even if he'd forgotten it himself in the years since. The letter was proof that Matthew had existed in the world beyond Caleb's experience of him, that he'd touched other lives, received kindness, passed it forward. The scope of that felt enormous suddenly. All the ways a person rippled outward, affecting people they'd never meet, changing futures they'd never see. Caleb had spent 4 years trying to contain Matthew's life to the boundaries of grief, to make it small enough to carry alone. But the letter refused that containment. It insisted Matthew belonged to the world, not just to loss. He stood and went to the shelf where he kept the few books he owned, field guides, mostly, and a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden that he'd read 100 times without absorbing. He slipped the letter between the pages and returned the book to the shelf, a small act of preservation. Outside, night had fallen complete, the sky scattered with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked out at the mountain, silent, indifferent, exactly as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. Permanent in a way humans could never be. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the work wasn't to be permanent, but to be present, to open doors in storms, to pay attention, to choose gentleness even when the world insisted on hardness. Matthew had understood that. Evelyn had understood it. And Caleb was beginning to think he might understand it too, or could understand it if he let himself. The cabin waited behind him, warm and solid and no longer quite so empty. He'd been alone here for 4 years. He could be alone for 4 more, or 40, or however long he had left. The mountain wouldn't judge him either way. But Evelyn's words echoed in the cold air. The world still needs people like you in it. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. But she'd walked 16 miles through a storm and nearly died and brought him a letter that proved his son had mattered to someone besides himself, and that felt like the kind of sign you didn't ignore. Caleb went back inside and closed the door, but not all the way. Left it cracked an inch, letting in cold and possibility in equal measure. A small gesture. A beginning. The fire burned. The night deepened. And for the first time in years, Caleb Ridge allowed himself to imagine that isolation might not be the only way forward, that there might be value in bridges, however accidental, that opening one door in a storm could lead to opening others. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan beyond tomorrow's firewood and next week's trapline. But tomorrow felt different now, less like repetition and more like choice. And choice, he was beginning to remember, was its own kind of freedom. The door stayed cracked that night, and the next, and the one after that. Not wide, just enough to let moonlight paint a silver line across the floorboards, enough to remind Caleb that walls were choices rather than necessities. The cold that came through bothered him less than he expected. He simply added another log to the fire and pulled his blanket tighter and told himself this was an experiment in possibility, nothing more. 3 weeks passed in the rhythm of late winter giving way to early spring. The snow began its slow retreat, revealing brown grass and exposed stone and the muddy chaos of melt. Ice broke off the eaves in sheets that crashed like thunder. The creek that ran 100 yards below the cabin, silent and frozen since November, began to speak again in whispers that would become roars by April. Caleb maintained his routines but found them interrupted by thoughts that hadn't troubled him in years. He'd be checking the trapline and remember something Matthew had said about wildlife corridors. He'd be splitting wood and wonder if Evelyn had made it home safely, if the fever had truly released her or was just waiting for another moment of weakness. He'd read Matthew's letter again in the evenings, studying the handwriting like it contained coded messages he'd missed the first dozen times. The isolation he'd cultivated so carefully developed cracks he couldn't quite seal. Not dramatic fractures, just small fissures where light got through despite his best efforts. On a Tuesday morning, when the sky held that particular crystalline quality that promised more snow before nightfall, Caleb made a decision that surprised him. He packed a rucksack with smoked venison and cornbread wrapped in cloth, shouldered his rifle more from habit than necessity, and started down the trail toward Millbrook Valley. The journey took 4 hours through snow that varied from ankle-deep to thigh-deep depending on exposure and tree cover. His legs burned and his lungs ached, and twice he stopped to rest, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to delay arrival, to stretch out the space between decision and consequence. But eventually, the trail leveled and the trees thinned, and the town emerged from the landscape like something he'd half convinced himself he'd imagined. Millbrook Valley wasn't much. Maybe 300 people scattered between a main street and the surrounding hills. A general store, a diner, a post office that doubled as the ranger station, a bar that opened at 4 and closed whenever the last customer stumbled home. The kind of place people ended up rather than chose, where everyone knew everyone's business and strangers were noted with the careful attention mountains taught. Caleb had been here exactly twice since buying the cabin, once to purchase supplies before his first winter. Once more 2 years ago when he'd needed antibiotics for an infected cut and couldn't wait for mail order. Both times he'd spoken to exactly as many people as necessary and left as quickly as possible. And both times he'd felt the weight of eyes tracking him, measuring him against whatever stories they'd invented about the man who lived alone on the mountain. He expected the same reception now as he walked down the main street, boots leaving muddy prints on pavement that had been cleared of snow but not yet dried. A few people glanced his way. Tom Hendricks sweeping the walk in front of his store, a woman he didn't recognize loading groceries into a truck, 2 teenage boys smoking cigarettes behind the diner with the practiced defiance of kids who thought rebellion meant standing in alleys. But something was different. Tom didn't just glance. He stopped sweeping and raised his hand in a wave that was unmistakably friendly. The woman loading groceries nodded as Caleb passed. One of the teenagers called out, "Hey, mister," not mockingly, but with what sounded like genuine greeting. Caleb ignored them all and headed for the address he'd gotten from the phone book in the general store during his last visit, information he'd filed away without consciously intending to keep it. The crosshouse sat at the end of a gravel road on the eastern edge of town, a small ranch-style structure with blue shutters and a front porch that had seen better decades. Smoke rose from the chimney. A truck sat in the driveway, newish, well-maintained. He stood at the end of the drive for a full minute, questioning every decision that had led him here. Then he walked to the door and knocked before he could talk himself out of it. James Cross opened it, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been suspicion before settling on cautious welcome. "Mr. Ridge." "Caleb? Just Caleb." "Caleb, then. I didn't expect to see you in town. I came to check on your mother, make sure the fever didn't come back." James studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. She'll want to see you." The house was warm and cluttered in the way homes got when they'd been lived in for decades by people who valued function over aesthetics. Photographs covered the walls, family pictures spanning generations, landscapes, a young girl who had to be Emma Frozen in various stages of childhood. Furniture that didn't match but fit together through long familiarity. the smell of coffee and something baking. Evelyn sat in an armchair by the window, a blanket over her lap, reading a book with the kind of focus that suggested she was actually absorbing the words rather than using them to pass time. She looked up when Caleb entered, and her face transformed, aging backward a decade through pure delight. "Caleb Ridge, I'll be damned." "Language, Mom," James said without heat. "I'll use whatever language I please in my own house. Caleb, sit down before you bolt. You look like a deer that just heard a branch snap." He sat, perching on the edge of the couch like he might need to run at any moment. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine. Better than fine. James has been hovering like I'm made of glass, which is annoying but comes from love, so I'm tolerating it." She set her book aside. "The real question is whether you're all right." "I'm the same as I was." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." James moved toward the kitchen. "I'll make coffee. Something tells me this conversation needs it." When he was gone, Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite the lingering frailty in her frame. "You didn't walk 4 hours through melting snow just to check if I still have a pulse. What's really going on?" "I read the letter multiple times. And? And I can't stop thinking about it, about what Matthew wrote, about the things he understood that I'm only now starting to see." "What things?" Caleb struggled to find words for concepts that felt too large and fragile to speak aloud. That kindness matters. That paying attention is work worth doing. That you can choose to be gentle even when everything's hard. He met her eyes. "I spent 4 years believing the best thing I could do was remove myself from the world. Stop being a burden. Stop hurting people by being someone who reminded them of loss. And now? Now I'm wondering if removal was just cowardice dressed up as consideration." Evelyn's expression softened. "It wasn't cowardice. It was survival. You needed distance to breathe, to exist without constantly performing grief for people who thought they were helping but were really just making it worse. There's no shame in that." "Maybe. But I think I've been surviving long enough. Matthew's letter, it made me realize he didn't see the world as something to survive. Most people in your situation would have stayed inside and pretended they didn't hear the knocking." Caleb considered the question seriously. "I thought about it. About leaving the door closed. Would have been safer, simpler. But there's a sound someone makes when they're dying that's different from any other sound. Desperation has a frequency, and I heard it in the silence between her knocks." He sipped the coffee, buying time. "My son died while I wasn't there. I didn't get to help him or hold him or tell him it would be okay, even if it was a lie. I just got a phone call from a state trooper telling me my whole world had ended while I was grading blueprints for a client who wanted custom bookshelves. So when I heard someone dying on my doorstep, I opened the door because I couldn't do anything else. Because letting her die alone felt like letting Matthew die alone all over again." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the tick of a clock somewhere in the house and the distant sound of wind moving through trees. James cleared his throat. "Thank you for being honest. Thank you for not throwing me out when I showed up uninvited. You saved my mother's life. You could show up every day for the rest of yours and still be welcome. I'm not much for daily visits. Then weekly, monthly. Whenever you need to remember, there's a world down here worth being part of." James leaned forward. "Look, I don't know your whole story and I'm not asking for it, but I know isolation. I spent 2 years after my divorce living alone in the woods, convincing myself I was better off without people. Know what I learned? Humans aren't built for that. We're pack animals. We need each other, even when we hate needing each other. Your mother manages alone just fine." "My mother," Evelyn interjected, "is surrounded by people whether she wants to be or not. I have James checking on me daily. I have neighbors who bring me soup and gossip in equal measure. I have a book club that meets every Thursday and a walking group that meets Saturdays when the weather allows. I'm alone in my house but not isolated from the world." She fixed Caleb with a look that allowed no evasion. "There's a difference between solitude and exile. You've been living in exile. Time to consider parole." "I don't know how." "Start small. Come to town once a week. Let people see you're alive. Let yourself see that the world isn't entirely terrible." "And if I can't?" "Then you can't. But at least you'll have tried." Caleb finished his coffee and stood, suddenly desperate for open air and the simplicity of trail and tree. I should go. Storm's coming tonight. Need to beat it home. Caleb. Evelyn rose despite James's protest and crossed to where Caleb stood. She was small enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, but there was nothing diminished about her presence. Thank you for coming. It means more than you probably understand. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. And I'm telling you that you did more than that. You reminded me that compassion still exists in the world, that people still open doors in storms. That's worth something. On impulse, Caleb pulled the letter from his coat pocket. I want you to have this back. It's yours. No, it's yours now. I carried it until I found where it belonged. It belongs with you. Evelyn, keep it. Read it when you forget why kindness matters. Read it when the isolation starts feeling like safety instead of prison. Read it and remember that your son understood something essential about the world, and he learned it by watching you. Caleb's throat tightened. He nodded once, unable to speak, and tucked the letter back into his pocket. James walked him to the door, and at the threshold extended his hand. You're welcome here anytime. And I mean that. Even if you just need to sit in silence while Mom reads and I grade papers, sometimes being around people without having to perform is enough. I'll remember that. The walk back to the cabin took longer than expected. The snow that had been holding off all day decided to make its appearance 2 miles from town, coming down in heavy flakes that reduced visibility to a few yards and made the trail treacherous with fresh accumulation over old ice. By the time Caleb reached the cabin, darkness had fallen complete and he was soaked through despite his coat. Inside, he built the fire back from embers and changed into dry clothes and ate cold cornbread because he was too tired to heat anything. Then he sat in his chair with Matthew's letter and read it again by firelight, looking for meanings he might have missed. You taught me that paying attention is the most important work there is. Had he taught that? Caleb tried to remember deliberately sitting Matthew down and explaining the value of attention, of witnessing without trying to fix. Couldn't recall a single instance, but maybe teaching happened in smaller ways. In the hours spent hiking without talking, just observing the world together. In the careful work of carving initials where no one but Matthew would know to look. In staying present even when present hurt. Maybe James was right. Maybe humans weren't built for isolation. Maybe the 4 years Caleb had spent on this mountain weren't healing but hiding, not recovery but retreat. But maybe that was okay too. Maybe he'd needed the hiding before he could consider the healing. Maybe exile was necessary before parole made sense. The fire burned low. The snow continued falling, and Caleb sat in the darkness thinking about doors and storms and the strange paths that brought people together. Evelyn had walked 16 miles through a blizzard and knocked on his door and brought him proof that Matthew's life had mattered beyond the boundaries of Caleb's grief. That was worth something. Maybe worth everything. He slept that night with the door cracked again, cold air mixing with warm, and dreamed of his son for the first time in months. Not the nightmare versions where Matthew died over and over in different ways. Just memories. Matthew at 7, drawing mountains in the margins of his homework. Matthew at 13, laughing at some joke Caleb couldn't remember but could still hear. Matthew at 19, home for Christmas break 2 months before the accident, talking excitedly about his classes and the research he wanted to do and the life he was building. Caleb woke with tears on his face and Matthew's name on his lips and something that felt dangerously close to peace in his chest. Morning brought crystal clarity, the storm having passed in the night to leave the world scrubbed clean and impossibly bright. Caleb stood in the doorway with his coffee and watched the sun climb over the eastern peaks, painting the snow gold and pink and colors that didn't have names. Beautiful. Lethal. The mountain in all its contradictions. But today the beauty outweighed the danger. Today the world felt less like something to survive and more like something worth witnessing. Worth paying attention to, as Matthew would have said. Caleb spent the morning doing routine tasks with something approaching contentment. Checking the trap line yielded 2 rabbits, fat and healthy, enough meat for a week. Splitting wood became meditative rather than merely necessary. Even the endless work of melting snow for water felt purposeful, each bucket a small act of self-care rather than simple survival. Around noon, he heard voices on the trail. His first instinct was to grab the rifle and retreat inside, old habits dying hard. But he forced himself to stay in the doorway, visible, making himself vulnerable in ways that 4 years of isolation had taught him to avoid. Two figures emerged from the tree line, Tom Hendricks from the general store and Marcus Webb, the ranger. They carried packs and moved with the careful efficiency of people who knew mountains and respected them. "Caleb," Tom called. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Depends on what you're intruding for." They reached the clearing, breathing hard from the climb. Marcus pulled off his hat. "We brought supplies. Figured after the storm, you might be running low on some things." "I'm fine." "I'm sure you are. But we brought them anyway." Tom unslung his pack and set it on the porch. Coffee, flour, sugar, dried beans. Some fresh bread from the bakery before it closed last month. Batteries for whatever you use batteries for. Consider it a thank you. For what? For saving Evelyn. For being the kind of person who opens doors when most people would keep them closed. Caleb felt something uncomfortable crawl up his spine. "I don't need thanks for doing what anyone should do." "Maybe," Marcus set his own pack down. "But around here, not everyone would have done it. You did. That matters to people." "I don't want to matter to people." "Too late. You already do." Tom pulled out a wrapped package from his coat. "Also, this came for you at the post office. Been sitting there for 2 weeks. Figured we'd bring it up rather than make you come down." The package was small, book-sized, wrapped in brown paper with Caleb's name written in handwriting he'd know anywhere. His ex-wife's handwriting. He stared at it like it might explode. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Fine. Just unexpected." "Want us to leave you to it?" "No, yes. Caleb forced himself to breathe. "Thank you for bringing the supplies. Tell people in town I appreciate it, but they don't owe me anything." "We'll tell them. They won't listen." Tom smiled. "Town's decided you're one of ours now, whether you like it or not. Saved one of our own. That makes you family of sorts." "I'm not family." "You're something. Call it whatever you want. Point is, you're not invisible anymore. People know you're up here. People care that you're all right. Get used to it." They left before Caleb could form a coherent protest, heading back down the trail with waves and promises to return in a few weeks with more supplies if the weather allowed. Caleb watched them go, then looked at the package in his hands like it was a live snake. Inside, he set it on the table and stared at it for 20 minutes before finding the courage to open it. The wrapping came away to reveal a wooden box, simple and elegant, made from cherry wood that had been oiled until it glowed. His hands recognized the work before his mind did. His own craftsmanship from years ago, from a life that felt increasingly distant. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph. Matthew at 16, standing at the summit of some mountain Caleb couldn't identify, arms spread wide like he was embracing the sky, grinning with the unselfconscious joy of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world could be cruel. Below the photograph, a note in his ex-wife's hand. "Caleb, I found this going through old albums. Thought you might want it. He loved the mountains the way you loved woodworking, completely, without reservation, with the kind of passion that made everything else seem small. I know we haven't spoken in years. I know the grief split us in ways we couldn't fix. But I wanted you to know I don't blame you for leaving. I wanted you to know I hope you found whatever peace you were looking for. And I wanted you to know that Matthew loved you completely, even when you didn't think you deserved it. Especially then. Take care of yourself. Sarah." Caleb read it 3 times, then carefully placed the photograph back in the box and set the box on the shelf next to the book containing Matthew's letter. 2 pieces of his son, carried across distance and time by women who'd understood something about preservation that he was only beginning to learn. The afternoon passed in strange emotional weather, grief and gratitude mixing into something he couldn't name. The recognition that running from pain didn't make it disappear, just deferred it. The understanding that maybe, possibly, he'd grieved long enough in isolation and could start grieving in the world. Evening found him sitting by the fire with the door not just cracked, but actually open, 6 inches of space between himself and whatever might come through. The cold was brutal, but he didn't care. He needed to see the stars, needed to feel connected to something larger than his own small suffering. The mountain spread out below him in shadow and moonlight, infinite in its indifference. But tonight the indifference felt less cruel and more honest. The mountain didn't care about his grief because the mountain didn't care about anything. It simply existed, permanent and patient and occasionally beautiful in ways that made permanence feel like a gift instead of a burden. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Another answered. Life finding life, even in the frozen depths of late winter. Caleb listened and thought about connections. How Evelyn had connected him to Matthew's past. How Sarah had connected him to Matthew's joy. How strangers from town were trying to connect him to a future he hadn't yet figured out how to want. Maybe wanting wasn't the point. Maybe the point was simply allowing. Allowing doors to stay open. Allowing people to care. Allowing grief to exist alongside other emotions instead of drowning everything else out. The fire burned down to coals, the temperature dropped, and Caleb finally closed the door and went to bed thinking that tomorrow he might walk to town again. Or he might not. But having the choice felt important. Having the option felt like progress. He fell asleep holding the photograph of Matthew, his son's joy captured forever in a moment when mountains and sky were enough. The photograph stayed on the shelf beside Matthew's letter for 3 days, before Caleb realized he was checking on it constantly, as if it might disappear if he didn't verify its existence every few hours. On the 4th day, he moved it to the windowsill where morning light could touch it, and something about that small act of display felt like acceptance. Not of Matthew's death, he'd never fully accept that, but of the fact that his son's life deserved to be visible, remembered, honored in the open, rather than locked away in grief's dark corners. Spring arrived in fits and starts, warm days followed by freezing nights, the mountain caught between seasons and refusing to commit to either. The snow retreated in patches, revealing ground that was by turns muddy and frozen, brown grass struggling toward green, early wildflowers testing the air before deciding whether to bloom or wait. Caleb worked outside more, repairing the winter's damage to his fences, clearing deadfall from the trail, preparing the small garden plot he'd neglected for 2 years, but now felt inclined to resurrect. He was digging out rocks from the garden soil when he heard footsteps on the trail again. 6 days since Tom and Marcus had visited, and Caleb had started to hope the town's interest in him would fade back into benign neglect. But the footsteps were lighter than before, accompanied by labored breathing that suggested someone unaccustomed to the climb. Evelyn emerged from the tree line using a walking stick, her face flushed with effort, but her eyes bright with determination. She wore practical hiking clothes and a pack that looked too heavy for her frame, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knew their limits but had chosen to push against them anyway. "Before you start," she said, breathing hard, "I know I shouldn't be here. James thinks I'm at book club. He squawed some. I'll deal with his anger later. Right now, I need you to not send me away." Caleb set down the shovel and wiped dirt from his hands. "You should be resting." "I've been resting for a month. I'm tired of resting. I'm tired of being treated like I'm made of glass." She reached the clearing and immediately sat on the porch steps, not bothering to hide her exhaustion. "I needed to see the mountain again. Needed to finish what I started. What you started nearly killed you. Living nearly kills everyone eventually. Might as well do it while attempting something meaningful." He brought her water from inside, and she drank it gratefully while her breathing slowly normalized. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, in a way that shouldn't have been possible between two people who'd spent less than a week in each other's company. "The truth is," Evelyn said finally, "I came to check on you." "I'm fine." "You're always fine. It's your default setting. But fine isn't the same as good, and I wanted to see which one you actually were." "And what's your professional assessment?" She studied him with a teacher's trained eye, the kind that could spot a student struggling even when they were trying to hide it. "I think you're better than you were. Not healed. Healing takes longer than a month. But better. Less hidden. More present." "Is that your way of saying I look terrible?" "It's my way of saying you look alive. There's a difference between existing and living. When I knocked on your door during the storm, you were existing. Now you're starting to live again, even if it scares you." Caleb sat on the steps beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "It does scare me. Opening up, letting people in. Every instinct tells me it's safer to stay isolated. Safe and good aren't always the same thing either. No, I'm learning that." They sat together watching the afternoon light move across the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Birds called from the surrounding trees, their songs tentative and hopeful in equal measure. New season, new chances. Nature doing what it always did, continuing regardless of human grief or human joy. I have a favor to ask, Evelyn said, and you can say no without hurting my feelings, but I hope you'll say yes. What kind of favor? I want to scatter Emma's ashes somewhere on this mountain. I've been carrying them for 5 years, waiting for the right place. When I was here during the storm, even sick and half delirious, I felt something. Peace, maybe. Or acceptance. The kind of quiet that comes from being in a place that doesn't demand anything of you. She pulled a small ceramic urn from her pack, simple and unadorned, the kind of container that held impossible weight in deceptive lightness. I thought maybe you could help me find the right spot, somewhere high, where she can be part of the sky. Somewhere beautiful that won't change just because humans need it to stay the same. Caleb's throat tightened. Evelyn, I know it's asking a lot. I know you've got your own grief to carry without taking on mine. But you understood her in a way most people didn't, even though you never met her. When I was delirious with fever, you didn't try to fix me or manage me or make me comfortable in ways that were really about making yourself comfortable. You just let me be sick. Let me be scared. Let me exist in whatever state I was in without judgment. That's rare. Emma needed that same kind of acceptance, and finding someone who understood it feels like a gift I can't waste. The request settled into Caleb's chest with unexpected weight. 4 years of avoiding other people's grief, of refusing to witness pain that echoed his own too closely, and here was someone asking him to deliberately wade into sorrow with her. Every defensive instinct screamed at him to say no, to make an excuse, to maintain the boundaries he'd spent so long constructing. But Matthew's letter was inside on the shelf, and his photograph was on the windowsill catching light, and Caleb was starting to understand that honoring his son's memory meant embodying the lessons Matthew had learned, that paying attention was the most important work, that kindness wasn't weakness, that you could choose gentleness even when the world was hard. There's a ridge about 2 miles northeast, he said quietly. You can see 3 states from the summit on clear days. It's exposed, gets brutal weather, but there's a strength to it, a permanence. If you can make the climb, I'll take you there. Evelyn's eyes filled. Thank you. We'll go tomorrow. Give you tonight to rest properly, and you'll tell James where you're going before we leave. He'll try to stop me. Then you'll tell him anyway and deal with his concern like an adult instead of sneaking around like a teenager. She laughed, surprising them both. When did you become wise? I'm not wise. I'm just tired of people lying to themselves about what they need. You need this. Your son needs to know where you are. Both can be true at the same time. They spent the rest of the afternoon in comfortable companionship. Evelyn rested while Caleb finished preparing the garden, turning soil that smelled of earth and possibility. She told him about Emma's childhood, the hospitals and specialists, and small victories that felt huge when your child was fighting for every breath. He told her about the furniture he used to build, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with his own hands, the grief of selling it all when the memories became too heavy to carry. As evening approached, Caleb insisted on walking her halfway back to town, at least to the point where the trail leveled out and became manageable. They moved slowly, Evelyn using her walking stick on the uneven ground, both of them quiet with thoughts too complex for easy speech. At the junction where the trail split, Evelyn stopped and turned to him. Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone else? If you want. When Emma was dying, I prayed for it to be over. Not just over for her. I knew she was suffering and ready to go. But over for me. I wanted my life back. Wanted to sleep through the night without listening for breathing that might stop. Wanted to make plans without calculating hospital schedules. I loved her completely, and I wanted her to die so I could stop being her mother and just be myself again. Her voice cracked. What kind of person thinks that about their dying child? The kind who's human. The kind who's been through hell and hasn't had permission to acknowledge how hard it is. James never knew. I couldn't tell him. He was so strong through everything, so devoted to Emma. I thought if he knew I'd had those thoughts, he'd hate me. He wouldn't have. And you need to stop hating yourself for it. How? How do you stop hating yourself for failing someone you loved? Caleb met her eyes. You don't, not completely, but you learn to recognize that loving someone and being tired of watching them suffer aren't mutually exclusive. You learn that being human means having thoughts you're ashamed of alongside actions you're proud of. Matthew used to say I was too hard on myself. Took me 6 years to understand what he meant. And do you? Understand it now? I'm trying. Some days are better than others. She reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you for saying that, for not making it easy or comfortable or anything other than honest. That's what you did for me. It seemed fair to return the favor. They parted there, Evelyn continuing down toward town and Caleb climbing back to the cabin as darkness gathered in the valleys below. The stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with light that had traveled impossible distances to reach this moment, this mountain, these two people trying to figure out how to carry their dead without being buried by them. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of perfect mountain weather that felt almost accusatory in its beauty. Caleb packed supplies for the hike, water, dried fruit, the emergency kit he always carried into backcountry. He was checking his gear when he heard voices on the trail, plural, and his stomach sank with the recognition that Evelyn hadn't come alone. She appeared with James, both of them looking tired from what had clearly been a long argument. James's expression was tight with worry and resignation, Evelyn set with stubborn determination. Behind them walked Marcus Webb in his ranger uniform, apparently present in some official capacity that Caleb didn't fully understand. Before you say anything, Evelyn started, James insisted on coming. Marcus insisted on knowing where we were going in case something happens. I argued, they won. We're all going together. This was supposed to be private, Caleb said. I know, I'm sorry. But James is her father. He has a right to be there when we scatter her ashes. James stepped forward, extending his hand to Caleb. I appreciate you helping my mother with this. I know you didn't ask to be involved in our family's grief. Seems to be a pattern with me lately. Even so, thank you. Marcus checked his radio. I told the station we'd be back by 3. That gives us 6 hours. Should be plenty for there and back if we move at a reasonable pace. They set out in a line, Caleb leading because he knew the terrain, followed by Evelyn, then James close behind his mother in case she stumbled, and Marcus bringing up the rear. The trail started gentle before climbing steeply through pine forest, switchbacking up the mountain's eastern face. Snow lingered in shaded areas, ice hiding under innocent-looking leaves, and twice Caleb stopped the group to point out hazards that could turn an ankle, or worse. An hour in, they broke free of the tree line and the world opened up around them. The valley spread below like a detailed map, Millbrook visible as a collection of buildings too small to look real. Other mountains rose in all directions, waves of stone and forest frozen mid-motion, extending to horizons that blurred with distance. The sky was massive, unobstructed, blue enough to make looking at it feel like falling upward. Evelyn stopped and stared, breathing hard but smiling. Oh, Emma would have loved this. She would have, James agreed quietly. They continued climbing, the trail now more rocks than path, requiring hands as much as feet in places. Caleb moved carefully, testing each hold before committing his weight, conscious that he was leading people less experienced in mountain travel. But everyone proved capable, James strong and steady, Marcus trained for exactly this kind of terrain, and Evelyn fueled by a determination that more than compensated for her age. The ridge Caleb had mentioned revealed itself gradually, first as a dark line against the sky, then as a dramatic spine of exposed rock stretching between two peaks. Wind hit them as they reached it, strong enough to require leaning into, carrying the clean, sharp cold of altitude. The view from here was everything he'd promised. 3 states visible on clear days, the world laid out in topographic relief, beautiful and indifferent in equal measure. They gathered in a sheltered spot where rock formations provided windbreak, everyone breathing hard, faces flushed with exertion. James helped his mother sit and handed her water, his movements gentle despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. This is perfect, Evelyn said, looking out at the endless sky. This is exactly right. She pulled out the urn and held it for a long moment, her hands shaking slightly. James moved to help her, but she shook her head, needing to do this herself. Caleb understood. Some things had to be carried alone, even in company. I don't know what to say, Evelyn admitted. I've been planning this for 5 years, and now that it's time, I don't know what words are big enough. Maybe words aren't the point, Caleb offered. Maybe just being here is enough. Will you help me? All of you? I don't want to do this alone. James nodded, tears already streaming down his face. Marcus removed his ranger hat in respect, and Caleb stepped forward because refusing felt impossible, because this was what Matthew had understood about paying attention, that sometimes the most important work was simply bearing witness to someone else's pain without trying to fix it. Evelyn opened the urn, and together they scattered Emma's ashes into the wind. The remains caught the current and dispersed, becoming part of the sky, the mountain, the infinite space between earth and heaven. Some landed on rocks and would wash away with the next rain. Some lifted higher and disappeared into blue. All of it returning to elements, ash to air to earth. The physical body released while memory remained. Evelyn spoke quietly. Words meant more for Emma than for the rest of them. You were so strong, baby, stronger than anyone should have to be. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I got tired of trying, but I loved you every single second, even the seconds when I was angry at the universe for making you suffer. You're free now. You're part of everything. And I'll carry you differently from now on, not as weight, but as light. Not as grief, but as love. James wrapped his arms around his mother, and they stood together crying while the wind carried their daughter and granddaughter into forever. Marcus turned away, giving them privacy, his own shoulders shaking with emotion he was trying to contain. Caleb stood apart, watching this family grieve together in a way his own family never had. Sarah had wanted to talk about Matthew constantly. Caleb had been unable to speak his name without breaking. They'd pulled in opposite directions until the tension snapped them apart. But here was proof that grief didn't have to be solitary, that multiple people could carry the same loss in different ways and still hold each other through it. After a time, minutes or hours, impossible to tell, Evelyn straightened and wiped her face. Thank you, she said to all of them. Thank you for being here, for helping me let her go. We didn't do anything, James said. You did everything. You climbed a mountain with me. You stood in the wind. You witnessed. That's not nothing. That's everything. They began the descent carefully, everyone tired and emotionally wrung out, but moving with the focused attention necessary when exhaustion made mistakes likely. The trail seemed longer going down, each step requiring conscious effort not to slip on loose rock or turn an ankle on hidden ice. Halfway to the tree line, Evelyn stumbled. James caught her instantly, but the near fall exposed something Caleb had been trying to ignore. She was pale, breathing too quickly, sweating despite the cold. The climb had taken more from her than she'd admitted, and they still had 2 hours of trail ahead. We need to rest, Caleb said, making it statement rather than suggestion. I'm fine, Evelyn insisted, but her voice was weak. You're not. Sit down before you fall down. They found a relatively flat area among the rocks and stopped. Marcus pulled out the emergency kit and checked Evelyn's vital signs with practiced efficiency. Her pulse was fast but strong, breathing elevated but not dangerously so. Fatigue rather than crisis, but fatigue at altitude could become crisis quickly. We'll rest for 20 minutes, Marcus said in his ranger voice, the one that expected to be obeyed. Eat something, drink water, let your body recover before we continue. Evelyn wanted to argue, but accepted the water James handed her and sipped it slowly. Color gradually returned to her face. Her breathing normalized, but she still looked fragile in a way that made Caleb's chest tighten with worry. I'm sorry, she said. I thought I was stronger than this. You scattered your daughter's ashes at 10,000 feet, James said. That's plenty strong. But now I'm slowing everyone down. We've got time, Marcus assured her. And even if we didn't, you're worth slowing down for. They sat together in the thin mountain air, passing around dried fruit and granola bars, speaking little because exhaustion and emotion had left them without words. The sun moved across the sky, changing the quality of light on the rocks, making ordinary stones look almost luminous. Caleb found himself studying the three of them, this family that had pulled him into their orbit through accident and compassion, who'd reminded him that isolation was a choice rather than a necessity. They weren't his family, would never replace what he'd lost. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that connection didn't require blood, just willingness. Just showing up, just paying attention. After 20 minutes, they continued down. Progress was slow but steady, everyone watching Evelyn carefully, James staying close enough to catch her if she stumbled again. They reached the tree line as afternoon wore toward evening, and the shelter of the pines felt like victory. At the trail junction where Caleb had said goodbye to Evelyn the previous day, Marcus checked his radio and confirmed they were still on schedule. "I'll walk them the rest of the way into town," he said to Caleb. "Make sure everyone gets home safe." "I appreciate that. You did a good thing today, helping with this." "I didn't do much. You did exactly what was needed. That's more than most people manage." James shook Caleb's hand again, the grip firm and grateful. "Come to dinner sometime. Mom would love to have you, and honestly, I'd like to get to know you better. You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, someone who'd shut the door on people who needed help. But you're not that. I don't think you ever were." Evelyn hugged him, her arms surprisingly strong despite her earlier weakness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving Emma somewhere beautiful to rest, for showing me that I don't have to carry grief alone." "Same to you," Caleb said, because it was true. Because she'd done for him exactly what he'd done for her, proven that witness mattered, that compassion was possible even in the depths of sorrow. He watched them continue down the trail until they disappeared around a bend, 3 figures moving together through the gathering dusk. Then he turned and climbed back toward the cabin, his legs burning with effort, his mind quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. The cabin welcomed him with familiar shadows and the comfort of solitude that was chosen rather than enforced. He built up the fire and made dinner from the supplies Tom had brought, beans and cornbread, simple and filling. While he ate, he thought about the day, about Emma's ashes catching wind and becoming part of the sky, about Evelyn's grief finally finding release after 5 years of carrying it, about James learning his mother was stronger than he'd feared and more vulnerable than she'd admit, about himself, standing on a ridge with 3 relative strangers, bearing witness to their pain because they'd asked and he'd said yes. That night, Caleb wrote a letter, the first he'd written in 4 years. He addressed it to Sarah at the Portland address she'd included with the photograph, and he wrote carefully, choosing words with the precision he used to choose wood grain when building furniture. "Sarah, thank you for the photograph. Thank you for remembering that I might need it. I've spent 4 years trying to forget what Matthew looked like happy, and seeing him that way again hurt and helped in equal measure. I'm sorry I left. Sorry I couldn't grieve the way you needed me to. Sorry I let the divorce happen without fighting for us. I don't know if sorry is enough. Probably isn't. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to do better, trying to be the kind of person Matthew thought I was." A woman brought me his letter, one he wrote to a teacher when he was in college. Reading it made me realize our son understood things about kindness and attention that I'm only now learning, or relearning maybe. I think you taught him those things too. I think we both did, in our different ways, even when we were falling apart. I don't know what comes next. Don't know if I'll ever leave this mountain permanently or if I'm meant to stay here and just visit the world occasionally, but I wanted you to know I'm still alive, still trying, still carrying Matthew with me, but differently now, with love instead of just pain. I hope you're doing the same. I hope Portland is good to you. I hope you found the peace I'm still looking for. Take care of yourself, Caleb. He sealed the letter and set it aside to mail the next time he went to town. The act of writing it felt like another small release, another step toward whatever healing looked like for someone who'd broken as completely as he had. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Another answered, and Caleb sat by the fire thinking about ashes and mountains and the strange paths that brought people together, pulled them apart, and occasionally, impossibly, brought them back. The letter to Sarah sat on the table for 3 days before Caleb found the courage to mail it. Each morning he'd wake intending to walk it down to town, and each morning he'd find a reason to delay. The weather looked uncertain, the trapline needed checking. The firewood supply was running low, excuses that fooled no one, least of all himself. On the 4th morning, he woke to find fresh snow had fallen overnight, just an inch or two, enough to make the world clean and bright without being dangerous. The kind of morning Matthew used to love, when everything looked new-made and possible. Caleb took that as the sign it probably wasn't, grabbed the letter, and started down the trail before he could manufacture another reason to wait. The walk to Millbrook took 3 hours through snow that crunched underfoot and air so clear it felt like breathing crystal. He passed the spot where he'd first encountered Evelyn stumbling through the storm, and the memory felt both recent and impossibly distant. 2 months since that night. 2 months since 3 faint knocks had cracked open a door he'd thought permanently sealed. Town appeared gradually through the trees, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of someone splitting wood carrying across the cold air. Caleb approached with the wariness that 4 years of isolation had ingrained, but he forced himself to walk down the main street instead of skirting around to the post office through back ways. Forced himself to be visible, even though visibility still felt like vulnerability. Tom Hendricks was sweeping snow from the general store steps and looked up as Caleb approached. "Well now, twice in 2 months. People are going to start thinking you're civilized. Don't spread rumors." Tom laughed. "Come in and warm up. Coffee's fresh. I'm just mailing a letter. Mail doesn't leave until 4. You've got time for coffee." The store's interior was cramped and overstocked in the way of rural establishments that served as grocery, hardware store, and social hub simultaneously. Shelves reached to the ceiling, packed with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to the kind of practical clothing that valued durability over fashion. A wood stove in the corner radiated heat, surrounded by mismatched chairs where several older men sat drinking coffee and engaged in the slow conversation of people with nowhere pressing to be. They looked up when Caleb entered, and he recognized a few faces from his previous visits. Nods were exchanged, cautious but not unfriendly. One man, weathered 70-something, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, gestured to an empty chair. "You're the one who saved Evelyn Cross. I gave her shelter during a storm. Anyone would have done the same." "That's where you're wrong. Most people wouldn't have opened the door at all." The man extended his good hand. "Frank Morrison. I've been living on this mountain longer than most of these buildings have existed. Nice to officially meet you." They shook, and Tom brought Caleb coffee in a chipped mug that felt solid and warm in his hands. The conversation resumed around him. Talk of weather, repairs needed before spring proper arrived, speculation about whether the logging company would renew contracts this season. Caleb sat and listened, contributing nothing, but found the rhythm of it unexpectedly soothing. People talking about ordinary things in ordinary ways, the world continuing its small necessary business despite all the grief and loss it contained. After a while, Frank turned to him again. "I knew your boy." Caleb's hand tightened on the mug. "What?" "Matthew Ridge. He came through here 5-6 years back. Was doing research for school, studying the watershed or some such. Stayed a week, camped up on the North Ridge. Talked to everyone who'd listen about conservation, about protecting the mountain from development." Frank smiled at the memory. "Smart kid. Passionate. Had ideas about managing the forest that actually made sense. Not like some of these university types who think they know mountains because they read about them in books. I didn't know he'd been here. No reason you would. It was before your time. But he made an impression. Helped old Mrs. Chen repair her fence when he noticed it was falling down. Spent an afternoon teaching kids at the school about native plants. The kind of person who noticed what needed doing and just did it without being asked." Caleb had to set the coffee down because his hands were shaking. He never mentioned this place. He loved it, though. Said the mountain reminded him of hiking with his father when he was young. Said those were some of the best memories he had. Frank's expression grew gentle. "I'm sorry for your loss. Town knew who you were when you moved here. Knew you were his father. We just figured you needed space to grieve without people poking at the wound." "You knew? This whole time?" Tom nodded from behind the counter. "Small town. People talk. But we also respect that sometimes folks need to be left alone. You wanted isolation? We gave it to you. Then you saved Evelyn, and we figured maybe you were ready for something different." "I don't know what I'm ready for." "Nobody ever does," Frank said. "But here you are anyway, drinking coffee with a bunch of old men instead of hiding on your mountain. That's progress." The post office occupied a corner of the ranger station, and Marcus was manning the desk when Caleb brought the letter. He weighed it, calculated postage, stamped it with the careful precision of someone who took even small responsibilities seriously. Portland. Marcus noted, reading the address. That's where your ex-wife lives, right? You know that too? Like Tom said, small town. People know things. He set the letter in the outgoing mail bin. For what it's worth, I think reaching out is brave. Grief makes people stupid sometimes, makes us cut off everyone who reminds us of what we lost. But at some point, you have to decide whether you want to keep cutting or start connecting again. When did you decide? Marcus leaned back in his chair. My daughter died 4 years ago. Different circumstances than your son. She had leukemia, fought it for 2 years before her body gave up. Afterward, I left my job in Denver, moved up here, took the ranger position. Thought the mountains would help. Thought distance would make it hurt less. Did it? For a while. Then I realized I wasn't healing, just hiding, same as you. He smiled sadly. Evelyn's fever breaking was the first time in 3 years I'd prayed for something and had it actually work. Made me think maybe I still believed in something after all. Maybe there was still point in caring. I don't know how to care without it destroying me. You learn, or you don't, and you stay broken. But at least broken while trying is better than broken while running. Caleb left the ranger station with Marcus's words following him into the cold. The walk back to the cabin should have been familiar, comforting, a return to the isolation he'd chosen. Instead, it felt lonely in a way it hadn't before. The silence was still there, the solitude still present, but they no longer felt like protection, just absence. He was a mile from the cabin when he noticed smoke rising from his chimney. His first instinct was alarm, someone in his space, touching his things, invading the sanctuary he'd built. His hand went to the rifle slung across his back, old defensive habits surfacing instantly. But then he got closer and saw the figure sitting on his porch steps, wrapped in blankets, waiting. Evelyn. Before you get angry, she called as he approached, I brought food, and I came alone, and I left a note for James telling him exactly where I was going so he won't worry this time. You're supposed to be resting. I've rested for 6 weeks. I'm fine. You nearly collapsed on the mountain 2 weeks ago. And I've recovered. My doctor cleared me for light activity. Sitting on your porch counts as light activity. Caleb climbed the steps and sat beside her, too tired to argue. Why are you here, Evelyn? Because I have something to tell you, and it couldn't wait. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her coat. I got a letter from Sarah, your ex-wife. His heart stopped. What? How? She found me through the school district records. Apparently you mentioned me in your letter to her. She wanted to reach out, to thank me for helping you, for giving you Matthew's letter, for being someone who understood what it meant to lose a child. She didn't have to do that. Maybe not, but she did anyway. Evelyn handed him the paper. She asked me to give this to you, said she wasn't sure if you'd read it, if she mailed it directly, but she thought you might if it came through me. The letter was handwritten on the same kind of paper Sarah had used for the note with Matthew's photograph. Caleb's hand shook as he unfolded it, and Evelyn stood to give him privacy, walking to the clearing's edge to watch the valley below. Caleb, I got your letter. I cried reading it, and I don't cry easily anymore. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for being honest about the divorce, about the grief, about everything. I need to tell you something I should have said 6 years ago, but didn't know how. It wasn't your fault. Matthew's death wasn't your fault, and the divorce wasn't your fault. We both broke in different ways and couldn't figure out how to break together. I needed to talk about him constantly because silence felt like erasure. You needed silence because talking felt like reopening the wound every time. Neither approach was wrong. They were just incompatible. I spent 3 years being angry at you for leaving. Then I spent 2 years being angry at myself for not fighting harder to make you stay. And now I'm just tired of being angry. I don't want that anymore. I want to remember the good years. I want to remember the man who built our son's furniture by hand and carved his initials in hidden places. The man who spent hours hiking with Matthew and teaching him to notice the small things. The man I loved before grief made love impossible. Evelyn told me you're trying to heal. I'm trying too. I'm dating someone. A teacher at my school, kind and patient, and nothing like you, which is probably healthy. I'm not writing to ask you to come back or to fix what broke. I'm writing to tell you that I forgive you for leaving. And I hope you can forgive me for making you feel like leaving was the only option. Matthew loved us both completely. He would want us both to keep living, to find joy again, to remember that pain isn't the only thing we share. Take care of yourself, Caleb. Take care of the mountain. And if you ever want to talk, really talk, not just exchange letters, call me. I promise I'll answer. With love and grief and hope in equal measure, Sarah. Caleb read it 3 times, then sat holding it while the world blurred around him. Evelyn returned quietly and sat beside him, not speaking, just present in the way she'd been present during the fever, during the climb, during all the moments when presence was the only medicine that mattered. She forgave me, Caleb said finally. She did. I don't know if I can forgive myself. Maybe that's the next work. Maybe that's what Matthew's letter was really about. Not just kindness to others, but kindness to yourself. Paying attention to your own pain instead of running from it. They sat together as the sun moved across the sky, painting the snow gold and pink. Eventually, Evelyn stood and stretched. I should go before James sends a search party, but there's one more thing. She pulled out a small wooden box from her pack, similar to the one Sarah had sent, but newer, unstained. I want you to have this. I made it myself. Well, I had help from a friend who actually knows woodworking, but I sanded it and oiled it. It's not much, but I thought you might need somewhere to keep the important things. The letters, the photograph, whatever else you collect as you figure out how to live again. Caleb took the box, running his hands over the smooth surface. The craftsmanship was amateur but careful, each joint fitted with obvious love, if not perfect skill. Thank you. Thank you for opening the door, for saving my life, for helping me scatter Emma's ashes, for reminding me that even in the deepest grief, kindness is still possible. She kissed his cheek lightly. The world needs you in it, Caleb Ridge, more than you know. After she left, Caleb sat on the porch and opened the box. It was empty, waiting to be filled. He went inside and retrieved Matthew's letter, Sarah's note from the photograph, and now her new letter. Placed them carefully in the box. 3 pieces of paper that together told a story of love and loss and the possibility of moving forward without leaving the past behind. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that was new but becoming familiar. Caleb walked to town once a week, sometimes with purpose, supplies, mail, and sometimes just to sit in Tom's store and drink coffee with Frank and the others. He learned their stories. Frank had lost his wife to cancer 20 years ago and never remarried because, as he put it, some loves are big enough they don't leave room for replacements. Tom had a daughter in Seattle who called every Sunday and sent him photographs of grandchildren he'd only met twice. Marcus had started dating the librarian, a quiet woman named Helen who loved books and mountains in equal measure. They learned his story too, not all at once, but in pieces shared over coffee and silence. Matthew, Sarah, the furniture building, the 4 years of isolation that had seemed necessary but had really just been postponement of the actual work of healing. On a Tuesday in late April, Caleb woke to find spring had finally committed. The snow was gone except for patches in deep shade. Green pushed through brown everywhere he looked. Wildflowers tested the air and decided, yes, now, time to bloom. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter and filled the trees with song. The creek roared with melt, loud enough to hear from the cabin. He spent the morning planting the garden he'd prepared. Tomatoes, beans, lettuce, herbs. His hands remembered the work even though it had been years. Press seeds into soil, cover gently, water. Trust that life would do what life did, which was persist despite every reason not to. He was tamping down the last row when he heard voices on the trail. Multiple voices, young voices, accompanied by the particular chaos of children who'd been told to be quiet but couldn't quite manage it. Caleb stood, wiping dirt from his hands, and watched as a group emerged from the trees. Evelyn led them, followed by a dozen children ranging from maybe 7 to 12, all wearing backpacks and looks of determined adventure. Behind them came James and a woman Caleb didn't recognize, presumably a teacher given how she kept doing head counts and redirecting wanderers. Surprise, Evelyn called. We're on a field trip and you're the destination. What? These are students from Millbrook Elementary. We're studying local ecosystems and sustainable living. I told them about a man who lives on the mountain and grows his own food and knows the forest better than anyone. They wanted to meet you. A girl with braids and missing front teeth stepped forward. "Are you the hermit?" "I'm not a hermit." "That's what Mrs. Cross said. But then she said hermit was the wrong word, and we should say self-sufficient instead." "Are you self-sufficient?" Caleb looked at Evelyn, who smiled with the particular innocence of someone who'd planned this carefully and was now pretending it was spontaneous. "I'm going to kill you." "Later. Right now you're going to show these children your garden and explain how you survive up here without a grocery store. It's educational." For the next 2 hours, Caleb found himself doing something he never imagined doing again: teaching. He showed them the garden and explained crop rotation, demonstrated the rain barrel system he'd built for water collection, let them examine the rabbit snares and explained why humane trapping mattered, took them on a short hike and identified edible plants, warning them never to eat anything unless they were absolutely certain of what it was. The children asked endless questions, some serious, "How do you stay warm in winter?" and some delightfully absurd, "Have you ever seen a bear wearing a hat?" He answered them all with a patience he didn't know he possessed, and found himself enjoying it, enjoying their curiosity and energy and the way they looked at his isolated life as an adventure rather than an exile. During a break while the children ate lunch, James approached. "This was my mother's idea. I told her you'd hate it." "I don't hate it." "Really? Because you look like someone who's being tortured." "I look like someone who hasn't been around children in years and forgot how exhausting they are." Caleb paused. "But exhausting in a good way. In a way that makes you feel useful. That's what Mom said you needed, to feel useful to someone other than yourself." "She's manipulative." "She's a retired teacher. Manipulation is a professional skill." James smiled. "But she's also right more often than not, and she thinks you need people more than you need isolation." Hard to argue with her when she nearly died and came back fierce enough to climb mountains and organize field trips. The girl with braids appeared at Caleb's elbow. "Mr. Ridge, can I ask you something personal?" "Depends on how personal." "Mrs. Cross said you had a son who died. Is that true?" The question should have hurt, should have sent him spiraling into the defensive walls he'd built so carefully. Instead, it just felt like a question, asked with the honest curiosity of someone too young to know that some topics were supposed to be forbidden. "Yes, his name was Matthew." "Was he nice?" "Very nice. He loved mountains, wanted to protect them." "Like a superhero?" "Kind of like that, yes." "I'm sorry he died. My grandpa died last year and it made me really sad. But my mom says we remember people by being kind, like they were kind." "Was your son kind?" Caleb's throat tightened. "Yes, he was very kind." "Then I'll try to be kind too, and that way it's like he's still here a little bit." She ran off to rejoin her friends, leaving Caleb standing there with tears running down his face and something that felt like healing cracking his chest open. James put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing was needed. When the children left, they left behind a mess of trampled grass and a garden that had been very enthusiastically examined. They also left behind something harder to quantify, evidence that life continued, that curiosity persisted, that the world kept making new people who needed to learn about mountains and kindness, and the way paying attention was the most important work. As the sun set, Caleb stood in his doorway and looked at the cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison in equal measure. The mountains rose around him, permanent and indifferent, but inside the box Evelyn had made sat on the shelf, and inside that box were letters proving he wasn't alone, had never really been alone, even when he'd tried his hardest to make it so. He thought about Matthew's letter and Sarah's forgiveness and Evelyn's impossible journey through a storm. He thought about children asking questions and Frank's stories and Marcus learning to pray again. He thought about how opening one door had led to opening others, until isolation became connection and hiding became healing. The next morning, Caleb made a decision. He packed a bag with tools and hardware and started down the trail to town. He found James at the house helping Evelyn with yard work, and he asked a question that 6 months ago would have been impossible. "You said you need help with repairs. I'm a carpenter, or was, or can be again, if you need someone." James straightened, surprised. "Are you offering to work in town?" "Once a week, maybe. Nothing permanent. But I could help with builds, repairs, whatever needs doing, in exchange for company. for reminders that there's a world down here worth being part of. We could use the help, and I think you could use the purpose. I think you're right. Over the following months, Caleb developed a new routine. 5 days a week in his cabin, living the isolated life he'd built. 2 days in town, working on whatever projects needed skilled hands. He repaired Frank's porch and built bookshelves for the library and constructed raised garden beds for the elementary school. The work was good, familiar, satisfying in ways he'd forgotten physical creation could be. He started eating dinner at Evelyn's house most Tuesday nights, and those dinners expanded to include James and his new girlfriend, Marcus and Helen, Tom and whoever else wandered through. The table filled with food and conversation and laughter that Caleb contributed to more naturally as weeks became months. Sarah called one evening in June, and they talked for an hour about small things and large things and all the things in between. She told him about her new relationship, and he was genuinely happy for her. He told her about the children's field trip, and she cried and said Matthew would have loved that. They didn't make plans to see each other, some distances were better maintained, but they made plans to keep talking, and that felt like enough. In August, a package arrived at the general store. Caleb opened it to find a photograph of Sarah smiling in front of a classroom, surrounded by students, looking happy in a way he remembered from before grief had rewritten both their faces. On the back, she'd written, "Still teaching, still trying, still carrying him with love. Thank you for reminding me we can both heal without forgetting." On a morning in late September, Caleb woke to the first frost of autumn silvering the grass. He made coffee and sat on the porch watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold. The wooden box sat beside him, fuller now than when Evelyn had given it to him. Letters from Sarah, photographs she'd sent, a small carved bird that one of the children from the field trip had made and insisted he keep. A note from Frank that said simply, "You're doing good, son. Keep at it." The mountain was still there, permanent and indifferent. The cabin was still there, shelter against weather and grief. But Caleb was different. Not healed. Healing was ongoing work. Not a destination, but healing. Learning to carry Matthew's memory with love instead of just pain. Learning that kindness to others started with kindness to himself. Learning that isolation was a choice he could continue making or could choose differently. People in town started calling the trail to his cabin Mercy Path, though Caleb never learned who started it, but the name stuck, appearing on the hiking maps the ranger station distributed, becoming part of the mountain's geography. He didn't mind. There was truth in it. Mercy had been shown to him in a storm, and he was learning to show it to himself, to let it inform his choices instead of fear. On a cold November morning, exactly 6 years after Matthew's death, Caleb walked to the ridge where they'd scattered Emma's ashes. He brought Matthew's photograph and his letter and sat in the wind remembering. Not just the death, but the life. The hiking and the laughter and the boy who'd understood that paying attention was the most important work. "I'm trying," Caleb said to the wind and the sky and the memory of his son. "I'm trying to be the person you thought I was. The one who's kind even when it's hard. The one who pays attention. The one who opens doors instead of closing them." The wind carried his words into the infinite blue, and Caleb sat until cold forced him to move, then climbed back down to the cabin that was no longer just a hiding place but a home, a place he could leave and return to, a place that connected him to the world instead of severing him from it. That evening, he built up the fire and opened the wooden box, added another piece, a letter he'd written to Matthew but would never send, telling his son about the children who asked questions and the town that had adopted him and the slow work of learning to live again. Sealed it and put it with the others, a collection of connections that proved memory could be gentle instead of just painful. The door stayed open 6 inches, letting in cold and possibility. And Caleb sat by the fire thinking about storms and mercy and the strange paths that brought people together. Thinking about how compassion, once chosen, could turn survival into meaning. Thinking about how one woman's desperate knock on a door in a blizzard had cracked open a world he thought he'd closed forever. The fire burned. The night deepened. And somewhere in the darkness, the mountain stood permanent and patient, witnessing it all without judgment, just paying attention, the way Matthew had understood attention mattered. The way Caleb was finally learning to pay attention again, to himself, to others, to the possibility that broken things could be gentle with their sharp edges instead of wielding them as weapons. The cabin was proof. The town was proof. The trail they called Mercy Path was proof. That opening one door could lead to opening others. That kindness wasn't weakness, but the hardest work there was. That you could carry grief and joy simultaneously, loss and love, memory and hope, all of it together without any piece diminishing the others. Caleb Ridge had climbed a mountain to hide from the world, but the world had found him anyway, in a storm, in a letter, in a child's question, in a town's quiet acceptance. And he was learning that being found wasn't the same as being caught, that sometimes being seen was exactly what you needed, even when you thought you needed to disappear. The fire burned low, the stars emerged, and Caleb finally allowed himself to believe that Matthew would be proud of him, not for the hiding, but for the slow journey back, not for the isolation, but for learning when to end it, not for the grief, but for transforming it into something that could coexist with living. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The mountain would still be there, indifferent and eternal. But tomorrow, Caleb would wake and tend his garden, and maybe walk to town, and definitely keep trying to be the kind of person who opened doors in storms, who paid attention, who chose gentleness even when everything was hard, because that was the work Matthew had understood. That was what Evelyn had shown him. That was what the mountain taught anyone patient enough to listen. That mercy, once offered, creates pathways both ways. That compassion given returns as compassion received. That the smallest gesture, 3 knocks in a storm, a door cracked open, a letter carried across years, could change everything. The cabin stood solid. The fire burned warm. And Caleb Ridge, survivor of grief, builder of walls, opener of doors, sat in the peace that comes from finally understanding that isolation was never the answer, that healing required witness, that you could lose everything and still find reasons to be kind. The mountain remembered, the valley remembered, and the path they called mercy would remember too, would carry his story forward in the names of trails and the memories of children and the quiet knowledge of a town that had seen a man break and helped him slowly reassemble. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to keep living, well enough to keep trying, well enough to prove that mercy made visible could light even the darkest places if you were brave enough to let it.